this isn't magical. We type questions into our search engines and get a response, and there's this thing in us that thinks, oh, this is magic. Wow, I can know anything. But in fact, behind what looks like magic is actually this hidden chain of human exploitation that has most affected those already on the margins.
I am Kwok, your host, and today's guest is Dr. Susan Reynolds, who teaches Catholic Studies at Candler School of Theology at Emory University. Welcome, Susan. Many people read about Pope Leo from the newspaper or headlines, but you have studied him quite closely. Can you describe what is the tradition that he comes from?
He's a first in a number of respects. He's an Augustinian. He comes from the Augustinian order. He is, of course, the first U.S.-born American to be pope. He was born on the south side of Chicago. He spent several decades in Peru. When he became a bishop in Peru, not in the United States. So he was a Peruvian bishop. And so he's really this hemispheric figure. He also spent several years in Rome before becoming pope. And so he is our first United States-born pontiff, which is really, really interesting. But he also brings this deep Augustinian spirituality and this really fascinating sort of hemispheric identity and hemispheric perspective to his pontificate.
Has he done something that surprises you so far?
I think that after Pope Francis, everyone was sort of, white-knuckled, clutching the handles of their chairs, trying to figure out what was next. Ever since the Second Vatican Council in the 1960s, at first you saw the global church sort of swinging wide in the direction of really creative experimentation and adoption of the principles of Vatican II in a really imaginative way. And then in the 1980s, you saw this real reaction from leadership during the pontificates of John Paul II and then subsequently Benedict XVI, a real kind of conservative backlash to this opening up. Francis, of course, brought something completely different, not only because he was the first Latin American pope. He was, of course, from Argentina. He was a Jesuit, but he brought this really profound theological sensibility that was forged out of a sort of theology of the people in Argentina, a real profound abiding concern for those on the margins, coupled with a kind of candor, a candid style that was honestly pretty shocking for a number of people, whether they were delighted or kind of horrified by it. But he really brought something that we had not seen before as a global church. And in a certain way, it really was kind of like a breath of fresh air had entered the church. And I think a lot of people were wondering, okay, what's next? Robert Prevost, who became Pope Leo XIV, was somebody that Pope Francis really trusted. And we've seen that he's very committed to implementing a number of the reforms that Pope Francis either started or kind of gestured toward. Pope Leo has a much more reserved style. He's kind of more quiet. He doesn't have that sort of off-the-cuff candor where it's like, okay, what's he going to say that Pope Francis had? And I think some people at first were wondering, okay, is the party over? But in fact, I think what we've seen is kind of an institutionalization of some of the really exciting reforms that Pope Francis started.
This linked to what we are going to discuss, that is the Pope's first encyclical, which was on AI, and why he used this AI as the first provocation.
Yeah, we had all been anticipating this encyclical for a long time. The day he was elected, just over a year ago, he signaled at the time that this topic would be a priority for him. That was symbolized in a way by the name he took, Leo. The last Pope Leo, Leo XIII, was one of the longest serving heads of the Catholic Church in history, hugely consequential figure, served from 1878 to 1903, I believe. So a really long time. And also during this really consequential turn of the century period, you're in the wake of the Industrial Revolution, where these urgent and like global questions about the nature of human society, about human dignity in these newly industrialized economies that had begun to generate wealth on this scale that the world had never seen before, but that also generating poverty on a scale that the world had never seen before, and had created this really sort of wrenching urban poor underclass of workers who were being exploited. And toward the beginning of his pontificate in 1891, the last Pope Leo penned an encyclical called Rerum Novarum on New Things, which was a response to this new social reality, saying that basically the church disagrees with unfettered capitalism. The church disagrees with atheistic communism. Instead, the church, in her social doctrine, which was a new idea, has something else to offer, a kind of third way that places human dignity as sort of the litmus test of the health of any economy. And that document basically inaugurated what's now known as the Catholic social tradition or Catholic social doctrine. In choosing the name Leo, the current pope signaled that we are basically in the midst of a second industrial revolution. And it's wild how even a year later, the growth of AI just in that time has made that initial statement of his really, really prescient, like really spot on. And so the church has been for a year anticipating this document. And I think, like the last Pope Leo, what the current Pope is noting, is getting at, is that we're in the midst of this massive shift in social conditions, in the conditions of labor and capital, this massive global economic upheaval that both has the capacity to generate wealth, generate knowledge in a way that we've never seen before, but that also has the capacity to exploit people on a scale that we can barely imagine. And that's really at the heart of the document.
What are his theological claims? That is, how did he back up from the long tradition of Catholic social teaching that you just referred to?
I would say there's kind of two theological through lines in the document. The first is theological anthropology in a digital age, is question catalyzed by AI. And the second is this kind of broader undergirding question about the development of doctrine, which is really interesting. I've heard, of course, we've all heard the first question talked about a lot. I haven't heard as much on the second question. And that's maybe because it's a little bit more like Catholic inside baseball. So maybe we can talk about that one secondarily. Primarily, this is for the argument about AI. What the Pope is trying to do is to engage us in reflections about human dignity, which is kind of at the center of the entire century plus Catholic social tradition. Questions like, what's the relationship between human dignity and work? And often when we hear that, we hear like, oh, productivity. And the document is really, really forceful, and I think does some of its best work on really trying to sever this popular Western, especially, idea that the worth of a person is bound up in what they produce. And of course, that's a mentality that leads to the exploitation of the very young, the very old, the disabled, many people on the margins who don't have access to work. So what he's doing is something else. He's saying, what is dignifying about work, about labor? What does a dignified economy mean? One of my favorite paragraphs in the entire document is when it starts something like, AI isn't magic. This isn't magical. We type questions into our search engines and get a response, and there's this thing in us that thinks, oh, this is magic. Wow, I can know anything. But in fact, behind what looks like magic is actually this hidden chain of human exploitation that has most affected those already on the margins, including children who are forced into labor to mine the minerals that make the kinds of smartphones and other technologies and chips that this technology requires, water that's being siphoned from communities that are already disproportionately affected by climate change, and so on. And so is kind of the thesis statement here. In this again, is very in line with a lot of the provocations that Pope Francis put out there, is that you can't have an economy based on human exploitation and call it just and call it good. There's a lot of work we need to do before we can understand it as a tool that dignifies people. It's not a Luddite document. This isn't something that's like the future is coming and we hate it. It's actually, in many parts, it's actually very conciliatory. And I know it was put together with the consultation of people who are experts. So this isn't just the kind of proverbial old man standing on his lawn shaking a stick at, the kids these days. This is a document that knows what it's talking about when it talks about AI. And I think that the response that it's gotten from those outside the church lends credibility to that.
I want to refer to what you just said, the Catholic baseball or whatever. That is the development of doctrine that someone like me who's not Catholic might have missed. What are some of the things? Is it a composite of many different Catholic arguments? You see a conciliatory tone in the presentation of this theological argument.
For anybody out there who spent time on social media, what used to be known as Twitter, might have noticed that there's a great deal of Catholic infighting right now, at least online. There's a lot of polarization within the American Catholic Church at the moment, and I would say perhaps the global church broadly. And one of the issues that often gets fought out in the public square between those who are self-professed conservative or traditionalist, those who are more self-professed progressive, is this issue of whether or not Catholic doctrine develops over time, whether or not doctrine changes. As a theologian, it's not at all controversial to say, yes, of course, doctrine develops. It didn't come out of the sky and appear to us on a silver platter. We know that doctrine develops. Anyone who is engaged in the history of the church know that doctrine develops. Nevertheless, there's this really tempting kind of traditionalist impulse often to see the Catholic Church and Catholic doctrine as this sort of timeless, unchanging pearl that withstands the tides of culture, withstands the tides of time. And, in times of crisis like we are in right now in our country, the Catholic Church provides unchanging, timeless truths that we can latch onto. And I mean, as an aside, I think we're kind of in this Catholic moment right now in the United States where we've seen a lot of conversions, especially from young men into the Catholic Church. And a lot of that, I think, is the result of this idea, very much propagated by the aesthetics of certain corners of social media, that the Catholic Church sort of floats above reality and this kind of anchor in troubled times, and that its truths don't change. And that's not true. And it's really fascinating that in the document, it's divided into several chapters. And the first two chapters are basically this primer in the development of Catholic social doctrine. And it's really detailed. You can see the influence of the theologian Anna Rowlands from Durham in the UK, who has worked very closely with both Pope Francis and Pope Leo, and has written a fantastic book on the development of Catholic social doctrine called The Politics of Communion. It's not only here are the principles of Catholic social thought, boom, 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 subsidiarity, common good, etc., solidarity. It's here's where this started. Here's how it developed. Here's how it changed. Here's what was left. Here's what was kept. Here's how this idea changed. You have these two chapters, not about AI at all, that are just about the development of the church's social teaching. And so we're primed for this, right? And then in the third chapter, he introduces this reality and talks about how, once again, the church is called to read the signs of the times and develop its social doctrine in conversation with the reality that is the current historical moment. And there's a really striking piece of the document as well that has gotten a little bit of publicity, but actually not as much as one might think given the subject matter. For the first time, And it's in, if folks want to look it up, it's in paragraph 176. I'm going to read the first sentence. In the development of her doctrine, the church has gradually come to a deeper awareness of the gravity of certain issues. The issue that he's talking about there is human exploitation and slavery. And he actually, at the end of that paragraph, asks for the first time on behalf of the church for forgiveness from the world, from victims, for the church's participation in the global slave trade. And this was really interesting because, of course, the church condoned slavery for many centuries. The church was central in the development of the slave trade. That was church teaching. And here we are centuries later with this gradual and then full understanding of the grave evils of slavery, which is, of course, now firmly instantiated in church doctrine, culminating in this begging for pardon on behalf of the church for its construction of that history. So it's really fascinating because he takes that notion of slavery and connects it to the ways in which the current economy globally is forcing people into lives of exploitation, different forms of slavery and human trafficking to prop up new kinds of exploitative industries today. So there you have this really fascinating kind of secondary current in the document, which is on its surface about like the church and AI. That's the headline. But the subtitle, the secondary headline is Doctrine Develops, and that's a good thing.
Was he the Pope that publicly addressed the slavery in such an important way? And listening to you talking about slavery makes me think, well, lefty is really an American or shaped by American culture and history. Would you say so?
I think in many respects he is. There's a plainness and a candor in the way that he addresses topics. And I think coming from the Western Hemisphere, when you're on this side of the world, your understanding of the slave trade is going to be different. I think that both from Francis and from Pope Leo, there's a more clear-eyed understanding of history and its consequences.
After reading it and studying the encyclical, would you change something that you might have used AI for, or how do you think that the encyclical will impact our ordinary life?
That's a great question. I am thinking about the conversations that I have with students, for example, is this discussion of what it means to cultivate an inner life. That's the distinction between human and machine knowledge, is that the bot on the other side of the screen doesn't feel things. It doesn't have emotions. It doesn't have a history. It doesn't have relationships, and you can't enter into a relationship with it. I think actually the thing that feels scariest to me about AI is the way that many folks have been sort of, I want to say, kind of tricked into feeling that they have a relationship with either a kind of specific personification of AI or just with their kind of AI tools. That is the thing that kind of feels most morally urgent and most wrenching. I think that AI can be a tool that is helpful, but it does not currently operate in a way that is just for the people who do the work on the back end. And I think that the document calls for a great deal more development there. I think what's most important is this urging of caution when it comes to this notion that AI is a relationship. Because ultimately it's not. That's the thing that can become the most alluring and the scariest, and that has the capacity, most of all, to rob us of our own humanity.
I have heard some Catholic women, they are very happy when the Pope spoke on immigration and on human rights, but they are still wondering whether this Pope will address gender or sexuality issues that will really open the Catholic Church to women's dignity and leadership. What do you think?
Yeah, we are all waiting. Those who are in or close to the Catholic Church might know that the Church has recently undergone a several-year process of what we call the synod on synodality. And this was begun and mostly completed under Pope Francis. in which he called for kind of global consultation, gatherings in parishes, gatherings literally in refugee camps, gatherings in communities, then increasingly global levels, with the hope that not only would this process would sort of renovate the processes of organization and leadership that the Catholic Church uses and allows more people's voices to be heard. There was a great deal of hope that this would be the moment, that it would be very clear of what women and men were calling for, the full incorporation of women's leadership in the church. And in that sense, many people were disappointed because we got mostly a continuation of the status quo in terms of gender roles in the church. But there have been openings that are small in and of themselves, but that I think in a 2,000-year institution lay this kind of brickwork that is necessary for a greater opening. And I think that this document, especially those first two chapters that deal with the development of doctrine, that make it clear in magisterial writing that church doctrine is not static, that it develops as we learn more about the world, as we learn more about what constitutes full human dignity. I hope that the way that the Pope has outlined how doctrine develops could provide an opening for the full incorporation of women in the leadership structure of the church.
Thank you very much, Susan, for speaking with me. I certainly learned a lot from you about the wider context of this encyclical. Thank you.
This was such a privilege. Thank you so much.